I come from Geelong today, and I pay my respects to the Wadawurrung people, the traditional owners of the land where I get to live and play. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course to any Indigenous persons who are here with us today. The outlook for Australian forestry and timber products, as Jason said, we need it right now, but we need to go some way to look perhaps into some topics that tell us why timber demand is an important topic and timber supply is an even more important topic now and into the future. So I want to share some of that with you today, and I imagine these slides will be available later if you want them, so you can go through those pieces. Part of my job in the modern economic world is to take these sort of pretty simple supply chain maps, and for me that's a kind of simplified version because I live in that life, I live in that space, but try to make them especially simple for you. And I'm going to try and do that today, to break that down, to look at some of the really kind of fundamentals of what a market looks like. This is what we do for a job, is take complex information, break it down in a simple level. We're only in the fibre supply chain is the short answer to what Jason was forced to read out a moment ago. I want to give you a global snapshot. Globally, softwood timber production has stalled over the last few years. It's stalled at around about 350 million cubic metres per year. Softwood is important because it is the vast majority of the framing timber that builds our houses, not just in this country, but around the planet. So when I talk about softwood here, for those who are less initiated perhaps in the softwood, hardwood and the language of the timber, think about that as timber framing. The wood available for timber framing, its growth in supply has stalled over the last couple of years. And Australia makes up a little over 1% of that total demand per year. So we're caught up in a global phenomenon, and I'll show you some of the reasons why we're caught up in that and why our share of the market is important. That data goes back to 1965, and over that period, the global sawn softwood supply has grown just 1% a year. And that's pretty consistent on an average basis, but you can see some peaks and troughs through there. The disturbing thing right now is the plateau that you can see in those last couple of years. And you have to pitch that against total demand growing at 2% per year. And if it was only 1% per year for 1 year, then sure, you're out 3.5 million cubic metres a year. But let's multiply that by 25 or 35 years. I'm good at this stuff, I can't think of that number, but it's tens of millions of cubic metres. Or let's operationalise it around houses. It's hundreds of thousands, if not if not millions of houses that can't be built if you don't have sufficient supply of the materials, the sustainable materials to build them. As a consequence, supply is tightening around the world. It's tightening because you have more demand chasing a stable and potentially even declining total supply. What's the fundamental driver of this? So for those who think about these things, demographic trends in these markets are everything. You cannot change, pandemics aside, you cannot change the patterns of global population growth. You can change where it goes. We'll talk about the Australian population shortly, but the global population has been growing consistently, as we know, and potentially and arguably at unsustainable rates, but inexorably. We can't change it. And we've got a stable supply of sawn softwood. So you can see the population growing on the right-hand side on the red line, but on the blue line, what you can see is global per capita sawn softwood production. Per capita production, so per head, the amount of timber, of softwood timber available to build house frames, it's been declining about 0.2% per annum for nearly 60 years, continuously. I look to the past in order to give a view about the future, and there it is. What you failed to do 35 years ago, you take account for and pay account for. In the immediate period, especially when you think it takes around 30 to 35 years to grow a softwood tree to its fullest maturity, so it can do its best work as a timber house frame. This has been written in the numbers of global demography and global production patterns for at least 3 or 4 decades. I'm starting to get nervous about that because I used to think of myself as a culprit of that. Recently, the fall helped. I've come to the realisation that I might be reaching the age where I'm actually a culprit, a real culprit in respect to that, as are all of those of us who've had time to make change and haven't necessarily implemented it. So one of the reasons why we've recently had a big boom in demand in Australia, and it's a global boom, has been because there has been, as I've described it previously, too much money going to far too many people for far too long. The housing economy around the developed world operates in such a way that $1 put into a housing market will typically do $5 work put into a non-housing market. And what that dollar does is it flows through a domestic economy very fast. So the hands into which it falls flow that money out into productive activity extremely quickly. So it's become the lazy economics go-to for trying to stimulate economies. But when you go to stimulate economies with money put in the wrong places, so for example, given to home buyers who in a higher interest rate might not have the capacity to pay the loan, what you do with that is you stimulate prices and you stimulate demand in an unnatural way where in some ways government might perhaps be considered when it does that around the world, as I say, in Australia, sure, but around the world, that perhaps what you're doing is you're stimulating demand in a way that's unsustainable and is an outsourcing of the stimulation effort that you're making when perhaps you should have put your money into the social housing activities and just paid for it yourself as a government on behalf of the people, because that way you can have more control over the specific expenditure, right? It's a debate the nation's having right now. I put that slide together about 10 weeks ago. I'm always pleased to be at the front of a debate. But we've been saying for a long time, the fiscal stimulus that we saw in Australia, which was mirrored in North America, in Germany and in France, if not in other countries, was too much money going to too many for too long. Should add less money, going to less people, should turn it off faster. And then we wouldn't have superheated demand around the world. Because what that did was it assumed that there was always going to be sufficient supply to meet demand. And just isn't the case. Just is not the case. As I've already demonstrated, there isn't sufficient supply and you have to take the supply side into account. I'm going to try and do both now in respect of Australia. But first of all, I do want to just make reference that it really hasn't been an easy time, including for governments, to get the proposition right about how to stimulate economies. These are examples from my day-to-day life, images that I just pulled out of our data bank, the sort of things that over the course of 12 months could wreck global supply chains very easily. You top those off with, well, they really did top off those events. The main thing on the right there in the green, that's just May this year in the port of Shanghai. That's just an incredible congestion of sea traffic, and what that does, of course, is it distorts both supply and demand as well. Not an easy time to be predicting, and I'm conscious that supply chain disruptions are all too easy to examine in the past and in history, but the reality is in real time, who on earth could have predicted any of those things, nor put them all together to make that mess work? What it did do was expose supply chain fragility, and for a country that still operates on a tyranny of distance, at least when it comes to goods, if not to services and the digital connectedness that we have. But when it comes to supply of materials, when we think about supply from far afield, we are still in Geoffrey Blaney's tyranny of distance. This is our modern version of that, and this is an example of why that can be extremely dangerous for what is still a relatively small, somewhat fragile economy at the far south of the world. So, what's Australian demand for timber products going to look like? What does it look like now? What will it look like? Demographics matter, as I said. The Australian population is growing. But interestingly, unlike the global population, the Australian population has actually been growing net over the last 20 years or so, solely because of migration. If we left it to hatches, matches and dispatches, then we would be flatlining our population and would have been doing so for a decade. It is immigration that has driven our population growth for the last 25 years, and it is immigration that will again turn the dial back up. This work, which we've recently completed for Forest and Wood Products Australia, models, and this data includes modelling in the zero net overseas migration of the last 2 years. And because I'm that kind of dismal scientist, we modelled it in for 2022 as well. So there's a little bit of upside on these three projections. These three projections are the low, the medium and the high rates of migration to Australia based on long-term trend and government policy. It will surprise some to know that the former government, who had particular view in respect of immigration, that they were actually on the middle path. They were not, had not stalled migration to the extent to which it might be imagined that they had from the public conversation, because everybody in public policy knows that population growth is driven by migration, and that economic expansion is driven by that population growth. We're likely to see over the next handful of years, current government, that will push closer toward and possibly for a time beyond the blue line trajectory. But I'll bank on us having a population in Australia that will be pretty close to the green line by 2050. So by about 2050, the range will be somewhere in 33.6 to 39.6 million. Now, by 2050, I really will be able to claim that I'm an older guy. And it might be that nobody's going to revisit me on the topic, but I know that's a big range. What do I tell you where I think it pitches now? I think we pitch to the green line. Why do I say that? Because we have for the last 50 years. That's the population growth trend. I'll follow the trend, right? What does that mean for us? We're going to have more people, and more people means more housing. But our population's demography is changing, and it's changing in this funny way. Like me, it's ageing. Like all of us, of course, but our actual average population is ageing. And an ageing population is configured differently to a younger population. We're having a progression from larger family dwellings to smaller. It's underway already. We're beginning to see it. I'm sure many of you are seeing it in the work that you're involved in, but we're seeing it in different patterns. The big trend of the next decade, this is only decade 2021 to 2032, the big trend in the next decade is the move to lone person households. So these are people whose partners have deceased or who end up for some other reason in middle life away from their children and separated from one another. Let's be clear about that. The rise in lone person households comes after family households. And so what arises in those situations is you get 2 for 1. So you lose one multi-person household, you get 2 lone person households. Not always, but the factor is toward the 2, right? So the growth in lone person households will be quite sharp. Still a relatively small, but growing, it's a relatively small growth, but it's growing quite quickly. The next piece in that jigsaw, when you have more people and smaller families, is of course you're going to have more and smaller dwellings. So just a quick thing on the smaller families thing. It's families, I think, are having it's 1.54 children on average at the moment. It goes down to 1.44 by 2032. That's a big change. In demography, that's a big change. And that change is going to continue, we anticipate, for quite some years beyond this projection period, the 2032 projection period. So what we might see is also an acceleration of not just the more really small dwellings for lone persons, but we might see a revolution almost in the size of the dwellings that the family is living in, because the average size of family of a family group is diminishing also. It'd be interesting to see if that pans out, but it's a suspicion we have that appears to be supported by the data, if not confirmed by it. So we say the dwellings of the future are going to be smaller, and we also say they're going to be more engineered and more factory built. Now, the big kahuna, I hope no one here lives in it, the big kahuna on the left-hand side, it's not my kind of house, I guess, from the conversation we're having, but it has bigger land, a larger building footprint, uses a lot more resources, has plenty more time where it's built on site. It is more expensive to operate, includes more embodied energy and emissions, and it's probably more expensive to build. when all's said and done. Still not brilliant, I suspect. People in here I know have much better handle on this than I, but the building on the right has a smaller land and building footprint, a lot less resources and much more potential for off-site fabrication. I work with a couple of businesses that could put the top piece on top of it. You build the bottom bit, they'll put the top bit on top of that for you and they'll bolt it down, no problem whatsoever. And I could probably build the whole lot out of the right materials in a factory, right? We're headed toward that trend. And there's several reasons we have to do that. First of all, because we're going to have smaller dwellings, smaller land use. But we're after buildings that are cheaper to build, that are more refined as to their engineering tolerances, and that are utilising materials in the most efficient possible way. And you only have to go past a major stick-built housing development out in the burbs to see large numbers of skips containing all sorts of high-quality building materials that a factory would find a use for, that a tip finds no use for when it gets hold of that big skip. Those buildings are probably cheaper to build, and where they're not cheaper to build, they're built for people who have much higher engineering tolerances and aesthetic designs that can be installed in the factory. I think that's the future, and I think there's a variety of reasons that will be the future. One reason is because on the projections I showed you before, Australia's total housing demand will ultimately rocket to about 258,000 dwellings sometime before 2050, sometime between 2046 and 2050. And I don't have to overcook that, right? That's built into those earlier numbers. That's it. Literally, this is the output of those numbers. Houses and townhouses will continue to dominate, but those houses, they'll be smaller, and the townhouses will actually grow their share quite significantly faster than houses. So houses and those freestanding dwellings and those semi-freestanding dwellings will continue to dominate the marketplace for new housing on demographic trends. But the other formats do begin to grow a little faster. And those other formats include the lone person households that are contained inside the ancillary dwelling types. So things like retirement villages and nursing homes and similar are included in that, extra bit of growth on top of the houses and the townhouses. So total housing demand is going to grow dramatically. There's almost no year, I'm trying to remember the top year. I think the top year in Australian history so far is a single year at about 238,000 dwellings approved in a particular year. 258,000 in 20 odd years' time every year. So on average, every year thereafter is a lot more dwellings on average. We've averaged those out to smooth out any troughs because these things, these things are not smoothed out like that. You don't get the steps. It will be a continuum. It'll have its ups and downs. And doubtless when we're talking questions, we'll have a talk about when the next down is coming. And let me be dismal then. Meantime, because we want to talk about capacity, Australian building supply chain is at capacity. This is just houses. The red line is the pipeline of work at the end of March this year. This is how much work is in the pipeline. This is how many houses are under construction, so they've been started but not yet completed. That is data that goes back, 55 years? It is double the number of houses under construction than at any other time in history. Our theoretical maximum production capacity for houses in Australia is about, this is houses, not just the other dwellings, is about 110,000 units per year, 27,500, less than 30,000 per quarter. You can get to 30,000 in a quarter, but typically you can't sustain that 2, 3, 4 quarters in a row. If you approve anything more than about 110,000 houses in a year, you put the rest into the pipeline. So we kind of superheated demand. When I say we put too much money in to too many people for too long, there's the line that proves the point. The bottom lines, the green line is what's completed. We've almost never completed more than 30,000 houses in a quarter. We've certainly commenced a few times, including recently, more than 30,000 houses in a quarter. But it follows that commencements and completions data is going to be very dependent, or the number of houses we can complete is going to be very dependent on our capacity to build the dwellings that we've got. the capacity is built into the same numbers, about 30,000 maximum per quarter, maybe 27,500 on average over time. So you can start to do some calculations on a pipeline of 110,000, and I know we'll get to this. But the thing is, you could build that out in a year as long as you don't approve any more dwellings. Meantime, even now, as dwelling approvals are starting to come off, we're approving 20,000 new dwellings per quarter. So if we build 30, add 20, we take off 10,000 per quarter. That pipeline of work can't be built any particular time soon, can't be built out any particular time soon. And that gives us a clue to the boom and bust that might be coming down the track. I just want to now throw the switch a bit to my genuine day job. Want to look at the monthly demand for sawn wood. It peaked in March of this year. So this is new demand coming into the system. This is not a pipeline or a volume of demand sitting behind that. This is new demand coming in, and it includes 60 years of data to provide a forecast 1 year ahead, month by month, of what the likely demand is for each additional demand is for each of those months. Over 60 years, the long-term average monthly consumption of sawn softwood for construction purposes is like 175,000 cubic metres or something like that. You can see how many months in a row for the previous year we were above that line. Every time, this is a timber version of that pipeline. Every time you're above the line, you've got work you haven't done, on average haven't done. Every time you're below it, phew, we got a bit of the work out of the way. We bought ourselves a little bit of the pipeline back. And you can see that that only really begins to soften toward the back end of next year in the forecast period, toward late 2023. So that confirms, from my point of view, that the pipeline of work includes 12 months worth, at least, of forward work where there's demand which is above the typical capacity of the market to meet that demand. So we say that the situation of some tension, some dynamic tension in markets for structural timber to build houses and other dwellings with has to last till at least 2023, but we can also see it winding down. Now, this is all math. We don't fudge those numbers. That's just straight out of a database. That's what the data tells us. That's what we'll report. So over the medium term, though, our sawn softwood demand is barely going to soften because we might see a downturn, right? We'll talk, as I say, we'll talk about that. But over the medium term, say through to 2050, demand won't soften much. And then it's going to boom as those housing approvals go. In 2021, our demand was about 4.6 million cubic metres. By 2046, it's going to be more than 6.5 million cubic metres per annum. We know now, because trees planted today are roughly available for harvest for structural purposes by about 2050, we know now that the domestic production capacity, the supply capacity, is going to be capped out at that red line. It's got a little bit of growth in it because the forest managers are experts at managing their resource, and they keep adding incrementally to their capability to extract resource. But what that means is that imports are already fundamental to the domestic supply chain in order to build the houses that we need to build to house the population that we have, let alone the population we're going to have. And they will become even more fundamental, amounting to something close to 40% of total supply on a every year basis, sometime before 2050. I keep being asked, well, why don't they just produce more? And the short answer is that there is no magic pudding. And there also isn't some boat sitting off the shore full of timber just waiting for permission to land and offload its goods so that somebody can get it to make a house with. It just doesn't work like that. As you've seen before, supply and demand are rapidly becoming out of sync around the world. We're part of the world, and guess what? We're in the same situation. No particular surprise in respect of that. So I want to talk about the supply of timber products in Australia. What we should know is that pretty much every bit of Australia's sawn softwood production that can be used for structural purposes is used for structural purposes. there's a really fundamental economic reason for that, to make more money there. The nation needs it, that's true, but that big green band through the guts of that chart on the left, that's structural timber. It's the majority of the timber product output, and it's a significant majority of the value in the supply chain. If the producers can produce more structural timber and there's demand for it, be assured that that's what they do across a range of different products and SKUs. And of course, the rest of the timber is used in a range of other worthy purposes, but the reality is that that supply chain is configured all around housing and all around structural timber supply. Even more so, look at the imports. The imports in the blue band there, so I got this round the wrong way. I'm not colourblind, but I'm a little bit stupid because the big blue band on the import chart should actually be the green colour. It's for structural timber. So over 90% of the sawn softwood we import goes to structural purposes. And almost all of the non-structural timber we get, this is softwood timber, that we get into the country, comes from New Zealand, comes just across the border. Because it doesn't travel as well because you get less money for it. Can't afford to ship it as far. Makes kind of basic economic sense. That's not the case, of course, for the structural timber that comes from very far afield. I won't go through that today, but the message in this is that all of the timber supply chain, domestic or imported, is absolutely committed to building the nation. So, the underlying proposition. It's what its purpose is, and the other pieces are ancillary to purpose, but very useful within the broader economy. Packaging materials, outdoor stuff for your garden furniture, etc. Went to progress. So when we think about demand, what we can see is that demand's actually at record levels. So consumption, this is literally the financial year ended 30th of June. It's an update on the prior data you saw. Consumption is at 4.478 million cubic metres and imports are 0.9 million cubic metres, or up nearly 34% last year on the prior year. Thank goodness we got it when you're trying to build out those houses and those other materials around the country. But that import reliance is an echo from the future, as I've just shown you. It tells us that with that sawn softwood production capacity, the blue line, that's all we can do. That's what the plantation estate can handle. There isn't more. So the imports are fundamental. Production is constrained, imports are the swing capacity, moves up and down in the cycle. And thank goodness it was available at such, frankly, huge levels and huge proportions. But long term, is that where you want to be? So imports are going to need to grow to 40% of supply to bridge the gap to demand. Now, I'm not a social conservative, but I'm an economic conservative when it comes to these things. It'll be more than that. Guarantee you. The reason is because what we can't model into this is our need to meet net zero before 2050 and the role that timber in the built environment must play compared to other products. I'm pretty good, but I'm not good enough to model that off all these other projections. Our model doesn't work well enough for that. It creates bodgy numbers that are so alarming that they really frighten me. So timber's going to have to do more work, not less, and we know the domestic supply is capped out. Well, we're going to be more reliant on imports, but global supply is not ours to command. So the threshold question for us is how are we going to get access to those imports for a period of time, and what else are we going to do? Meantime, imports have grown, right? That's good, great. Thank you to the global market for its supply. But what this shows you is that per dwelling, imports are declining as a proportion. So the total volume's growing, but the total number of houses is growing faster. So as a proportion of total house, and there are periods where it blips up and down, but the red dotted line's the one for me. Imports per cubic metres of imports, it's an index, right? Smooths it out a bit. Imports are cubic metres of imports per house approval over a period of time. So the volume's increasing, but the proportion is declining. It's not a really fast decline, but it tells us it's another way of saying, hey, we're in the same situation. So we can't command the imports, but what we can do is pay for it. The price we pay really does matter, and I'll return to price in a minute. So what's a market do when it's struggling with structural timber supply to build its traditional houses? It finds another way. And the way in which the timber market has found another way, globally and certainly domestically, is by utilising more and more engineered wood products. And those engineered wood products have particular interest, I think, in a sustainability sense, but absolutely in a construction environment sense, because they tend to utilise timber that would not, at least in all of it, would not be used in structural purposes otherwise. They tend to reassemble the timber in a way that creates a new product which has greater structural integrity that can then be used to build a structure rather than perhaps be put outside in your garden bed as a piece of garden bedding, for example. That's the advantage of utilising engineered wood products. And you can see that there's a range of them. You can see the product that dominates for the year ended June is laminated veneer lumber. And we're going to talk a moment about that, but you can see that there's a group of other products. And some of them, in particular, are made locally and can really only be made locally. So they utilise lower value timber and some other things and they build a product. And some of almost all of those are built in relatively small sized factories where the fabricators are who are building the wall frames and the trusses. It's innovative, it's entrepreneurial, and it's very resource efficient when they do it because they're using their offcuts from their other processes. Now, products like laminated veneer lumber, they dominate this market. We're talking hundreds of thousands of cubic metres a year, and 80% of it's imported. And where's it imported from? I felt black-hearted when I wrote this, so I used a black line, not a red line for this one on the right-hand side. 80% of it, of the 80% of imports, come from Russia and mainland China. Oh, so we don't want to be import reliant, and there's certain places we especially don't want to rely on for our imports long into the future. So these come under the categories over time of imports of wooden posts and beams. And look what just turning back to the left-hand side, look what we've done under these wooden posts and beams just in the last year. We've more than doubled our imports. And what's occurred there is we've done that because we didn't have enough structural timber, so we brought in more of those products that were really significant, high-quality structural products. But we exposed our supply chain to enormous risk by doing that. And that risk is written on the right-hand side. You can draw your own views about whether my black downward-pointing arrow of increasing supply from Russia and China is correctly characterised as a risk to our domestic housing supply chain or not. I know where I stand on it. So I said you've got to say something about timber prices here. So let's be a classicist in economics for a moment. So demand goes up, supply stable or lower. Where's the intersection point? It's a magic place called price. And the magic place called price, because demand's gone up and supply's gone down, is higher. We know that. Timber prices have been way high, right? Contract prices are higher. Import prices on spot markets are higher. Everyone quotes to me spot prices because that's kind of the big exciting number. The thing I watch is contract prices, and they're up. They're up a lot. Let me show you how we know this. Timber and wood product prices cannot deteriorate over the longer term because of those supply and demand balances. But if we look off here on the left-hand side at the US housing permits and lumber prices, we can see the lumber prices. So the poly there, the red dotted line shows the average growth in lumber prices over just a 3-year period is more than double. That's an average price, contract and spot included, in the US market. Now, why does that happen? A lot more of the US market is highly traded. They have many more participants, both buyers and sellers, so they have a lot more spot trade than we have in Australia. So over on the right-hand side, same period of time, albeit done on a quarterly basis, you see the red polyline is much more muted. We've seen price increases but we haven't really seen price increases. Why? Smaller number of participants in the market. The average price is actually drawn up by the market signal that's come from import prices. So we've got a smaller number of market participants, and that means there's a lot more contracts and a lot less spot pricing. And so the market movements are muted. But while they're muted, they're also actually harder to turn back down. The US market turns on a dime. Look at ours. It wouldn't turn on a $100 note. It just rolls its way through, right? That average black line price. So the black lines tell us another story. Market volatility in pricing. We don't have a lot of it yet when it comes to timber prices. But we do have, in some parts of the market, market volatilities. These are import prices. You can see the black line is the year-ending volume tracking up. Sorry, that's the year-ending price tracking up, and it moves around a bit more. But the weighted average monthly price on the red line, so the import price is already tracking up, but the weighted average price on the red line shows you what happens in an international market. This is volatility. If that's 20% of the market right now, then 20% of the market is paying that as an average price compared to what we saw in the total average. The more you rely on the imports, the more you are susceptible to that volatility. We're going to see that in this market. The average price of timber might return to trend. The red line through there is a trend line of growth. But I don't really think so. But it's not going to trough. It won't crash. It can't crash because the domestic supply is contracted, locked away, and has metronomic behaviour as to supply and as to price. And the import supply moves up and down based on global conditions. And the global conditions have got a supply and demand misfit. Price is going to be higher. Now, in wrapping up, the pipeline of houses that we have to build is going to be above normal until at least late 2023. The work is pretty much assured through to then. There'll be ups and downs, there'll be builders come and go because of a variety of factors right now. It's after that you want to be a bit more concerned, I think. You can expect to see a sharp downturn when the pipeline gets built out, but it may not last long. Depends on how we collectively respond. Long-term demand is going to be baked in, thanks largely to population growth, and timber supply is going to continue to be tight, but as some of you would know, is actually already improving in the current marketplace. It's for long-term situation to be more difficult because more often we're going to see more demand and we're going to see demand growing faster than supply. So it is going to get more difficult more often. And I think I've demonstrated over-reliance on imports is a reasonably serious supply chain risk, which is why there's an industry focus on increasing local production. And when we say increasing local production, let me cease to be the dismal scientist and now be the half-full glass. You only have to look here, and I should say that my firm is independent, not paid to be here. You look here at the sort of product that a company like WeatherTex makes out of a group of products which are generally and genuinely treated as residues of other processes. For the most part, those products that are being manufactured by them are of that nature, yet they have a significant place in the marketplace because they've evolved that over a period of time. They're not alone. It's just an example of ingenuity, of a bit of intuition and a whole lot of supply chain thinking. It's the same supply chain thinking that sees enormous amounts of effort going into producing more engineered wood products in Australia from material that could not otherwise be used structurally. We may not bridge the gap of all of the imports, and we may still struggle at different times, but I'm directly involved in a couple of serious activities, some commercial, some research related, that are involved in developing more of those higher value added pieces to meet exactly this building market of the future, which is what gives me some confidence, but certainly some surety about building more buildings inside factories than we ever have before. They will be more efficient, and the people who are thinking about doing those buildings are the same people thinking about the engineered wood products for the same efficiency reasons. That's a trend worth getting on. And when it comes to the prices for sawn timber and other wood products, they're going to remain high. If you're a buyer in that market, lock away whatever contracts you can for whatever period of time you can, because those prices are going to remain high. They're unlikely to go back to low levels that they were at previously. I'm always accessible, if long-winded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Do we have any questions?
Do we have any questions? I'm sure we do.
I've got a few on the chat.
Fantastic.
There'll be a few more as well.
Sure.
Hey Tim, so you're talking about obviously how the housing market is going to increase to 258,000, and
Yep.
my industry sources tell me that historically we've had about 25% of timber imported, and if we're going to go up to 40%, I'm just curious, and I know obviously you are an expert in Australia. Have you done any modelling about overseas and potentially what that impact might have? Like if other countries are going to have the same growth, will there be the import potential
Yep.
for us?
Oh, I think, thanks Marie-Claire, I think that's exactly the point, is that there is significant demand elsewhere. So one of the reasons, I didn't touch on it before, but one of the reasons why, I suppose in part I did touch on it, one of the reasons why we have to pay such significantly higher import prices is because for one of the first times in history, our market boom came at the same time as the North American market boom, which was fed by European timber supply. And essentially, the Europeans made a choice about sending a shipload, careful words there, a shipload of sawn timber into the highest value market on the planet over a shorter journey than a half a container load, frankly and respectfully, down here on a longer journey at a cheaper price. Go figure. They're going to continue to do that, right? They're going to follow the money. The US housing market is remarkable for its ability to flex, and that screws up the entire sort of metronome that could exist in the global trade otherwise, but it is what it is. So I think the North American market is the place that's going to soak up at different times huge amounts of the same supply that we're chasing.
I've got a question on the live stream as well, and that is, has the bushfires of 2019 affected the supply of timber?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. By a factor of, in total, around somewhere between 8 and 12% of the total softwood plantation estate was disrupted, if not destroyed, in the fires. There was a huge amount of salvage effort, large amount of timber was extracted from that. Material is in the market and has been in the market from that salvage, but a large amount of the planted timber was lost, but not the land, right? So the replanting has occurred, and there are patterns of readjustment occurring around harvesting patterns. But I guess the broader question is that there's no doubt that fire events, regardless of how caused, but certainly those that are derived from anthropogenically induced climate change and the patterns of change that occur over time, are going to be more prevalent on the global plantation estate, not just ours domestically. And so again, as you know, the impact here, we see fires in growing regions in Spain, for example, right now. There are plantations being burned right now, and they could potentially have been plantations that were going to supply us in the future.
Yeah, it's a good point too. Just to follow up that as well, like if you look what's happened in Russia over the last 6 months in terms of, you know, for example, FSC responsible PFC certification, no longer accepting that particular product as well. The Australian government's actually looking at different provisions as well to actually reduce their reliance on that product as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly correct that there's appropriate measures in place to avoid conflict wood entering our supply chain and frankly polluting our lives. But those events, that event is very significant, but those events will continue to arise from time to time, hopefully not as egregious as this particular situation. But all that means to us is that whether it's the LVL or the sawn timber, is there anything that shorts the world of bits of supply for a period of time will have a significant impact on us. We are more and more part of the world when it comes to our wood supply.
Fantastic.
So the fact that our plantation production is plateauing out is an indication that we haven't been planting.
Correct.
Originally, those plantations, I understand, were government initiated, moved into private. So are what we're seeing now a failure of government policy or industry policy or both? And what do you see for the future? What's being done about 2050 supplies?
Yep, good question, David. So they were previously owned, and some still are, owned by government, or at least through government agencies. They're certainly funded by the public, and those are now, but in the main, they are private assets now. The framework of plantation expansion always has to be viewed against other land uses, and the other land uses include food production. So if you're going to expand your plantations, you have to be a higher and better, so not just higher value in terms of economic value, but a better value from a community standpoint, utilisation of the land. And that's really challenging, whether you're in government or you're a private company. It's not only about the price that you're prepared to pay for the land or the discount rate that you're prepared to make. It's also about the land use consideration, and that's proving to be difficult in this country. There are pretty significant measures underway that are designed to support resolution of those issues to the point where there's new plantations over the next kind of handful of years. But it would also be fair to say that we have not planted more trees over the last 5 years, where those efforts have been accelerating and becoming more urgent. So it's a pretty tricky issue. It goes beyond, my view is it goes beyond commercial and government. It goes to that question about land use and appropriateness of land use and appropriateness in context. So in the context of different regional communities. Some have different attitudes to others, right?
I've got another question here.
Just a quick, actually, one more observation, another question. Clearly, from your presentation, we're in substantial trouble and doesn't seem to be getting better anytime soon. In fact, the gentleman in the front raised the issue about lack of plantations, etc., has exacerbated the situation. Is there any way out of it? In other words, can we divert the structural, whatever the framing timber we're using to other, you mentioned the laminated type products. Is certainly one way around it, but are there any other materials that you see? There's clearly a fairly dire drama at the moment.
Well, yep, thank you. I think there's a really key piece around, we have sawn structural timber. Other timber that is not of structural use can be reassembled into different things in different ways to add to that stock of structural material in total. And the more buildings we build in factories, I guarantee you, we will use less resources and waste less resources if we build more in an off-site environment. So if you start to put those pieces together and you start to jigsaw together a smaller population, they're coming to get me. You start to jigsaw together those pieces in a way that maximises resource all the way through, you can build a lot more houses with that resource. Will it be enough? No. Will it be sufficient to end our utilisation of imports? No. But we have, as Marie-Claire said before, we've relied on imports anyway for a really long time at a certain level. It's just when that gets too much that it's too much.
The reference to all this framing material, I don't know much about, I'm not a builder, but I see a lot of homes use different kind of materials. Yeah. And there's an enormous trend over the last 5 to 10 years to use concrete slab. The whole homes are concrete. Continuously we're seeing beautiful homes coming up, very high-end type properties where there's minimal timber.
Sure.
So is there any way, I mean, if we're that much in dire straits and there is going to be a demand for X 100,000 homes a year, will housing not have to completely rethink, I mean, don't want to make any bad comments or whether Texas future, but I'm sure they can use some lovely flooring, But all I'm saying to you is, surely if it's as bad as you point out and it looks extremely dire, surely there's going to be a greater emphasis on concrete slab building or whatever.
Well, I think the cost, embodied energy and carbon and climate factors will frankly outdo the embodied energy driven building materials. I think they're dead meat, to be honest. And if I was a young man now, I wouldn't be investing anywhere near them. I'd be investing in those things like the timber products that you're able to do more with by being smarter with them. And I think there is a group of, I've tried to provide some pointers behind the dismal about the group of things that need to come together in some supply chain thinking, where the supply chain starts with where people live and it ends with us planting more trees. And if you do a bit in each of those, then you get a lot more dwellings out of that. And that's a next phase of some work that we're involved in, is trying to start to bring those pieces together. But if you've got smaller families living in smaller houses, you build more of them more efficiently, you utilise more sustainable resources, and then you take the byproducts of those and you make yet more sustainable products, then you build a lot more dwellings for people, certainly than you get out of vast concrete dwellings.
Understanding or numbers or how we've got a bit of exposure in New Zealand. How are you seeing the market in New Zealand?
Only limited,
Yep.
Jason, exposure to the New Zealand market from our point of view. So the New Zealand market is hypersensitive from my point of view. It behaves like, I would describe it as behaving like a large version of a Tasmanian housing market. So if you look at the Tasmanian market, up and down all over the place. We looked recently at Auckland for a client who wanted to know what their opportunity was. And I guess to the previous point, too much concrete in that market for that to be sustainable. That's a government objective there. I think it's an unpredictable market in New Zealand. But what is predictable is their interest rates and their exchange rate. They track the Australian model, so if you would know that. But if you're in that business, you can rely on those things. But I don't think government's role in New Zealand is as robust in the housing market as it could be or might become. That's the other thing I hear, is that there's some prospect, like in Australia, of some social housing investment in New Zealand, and that government will not look to an unsustainable building product or solution. They'll be looking to sustainable solutions. So you'll be in the box seat.
We're hearing councils are looking at a better than zero carbon footprint being measured on homes. Are you hearing that too?
Yeah, it's exactly the point. And I understood that there was legislation that is starting to be kicked around that, which is why our client was exactly in that conversation. It was like, oh, what can we do here? Can we go to Auckland? Auckland will be hard, but cities like Wellington and maybe some of the southern cities, pretty hard to get concrete down those places, pretty easy to get other products, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting on that point too. So with the Responsible Wood, we managed the PFC New Zealand scheme, and we had some discussions with Housing New Zealand, and they were looking at using engineered timber products for some of their affordable housing projects as well. So it's a growing, in some ways they're probably a bit more progressive than we are in that sense as well. I've got a question here from the live stream, and that is, of course, we're inundated all the time with news of impending house builders collapses. So in case you watching the news yesterday, you'd probably say there's another house builder that's gone under. And I guess we're looking at, is there any technology, intel or analysis that can be used to forecast the next impending housing collapse? Do you have an answer for the $60,000 question?
Yeah. So if I had that crystal ball, I'd have many, many bags of $64,000.
It would be a bit more than $64,000 question.
But there is a clue, and I provided it before in the housing pipeline. There's 100,000 houses in the pipeline at the end of March. On average, over the long term, we've built 27,500 at maximum per annum. So, and we're approving about 20,000 per quarter. So the pipeline is going to get down, and the normal pipeline is 35 to 40,000. So we're going to get down to that level around about the end of next year. After that, approvals will be exceeded by completions. The pipeline will become small and will be insufficient to sustain the total building market, the house building market, for a period of time. I think I hate forecasting on the run, but I think if you think about the first half of 2024 as being the likely point at which the market hits some sort of new trough, and it could be quite sharply down, then that would be around about right. And then thereafter, something will give, and I think the something that will give is the impact of new migration, frankly. We're having that debate in the nation next week about skills and labour and migration, and one of the solutions will be appropriately balanced return to proper migration patterns. Those patterns will add a couple of 100,000 people a year. On average, it takes 2 years before a migrant family is in the market for a dwelling. So I reckon early 2024 on the down, maybe not that long, however.
It's interesting actually, because I read some data that actually indicated that in Victoria, the biggest export is education, and having the students
Yep.
through to the universities, through into Victoria has really driven that
Yep.
demand as well.
Yep, and it's disrupted, of course.
A great presentation. You know, with the things, the way it is going, like 40% depending on import, it's not good for any industry. So I know we started using timber because it's locally available, but now we are moving into a stage where in 2050 that we are completely or 50% relying on
Yep.
imports. So should we look at, you know, an innovative locally made product rather than wood to construct in future?
I don't think there's any more innovative product than the one that's, you know, naturally made and locally available. But I think that's the point about using our resources in a more efficient and an ever more efficient manner. That's and you know, a lot of the message from industry would be, if you want us to be delivering on that, then you have to be a part of that in a supply chain sense. And in a supply chain sense, I guess the articulation I'm making is it starts with where people live and it goes back to what we end up planting. And you turn the dial at every one of those stages, in design, in the building process, in the milling and manufacturing processes, and you will get a lot more of that resource and you will be less reliant. And the point about looking to 2050, which is a pretty substantial piece of work we completed for, funded by the federal government through FWPA, was to say by 2050, what's it look like if we don't do those types of things? The next piece in that work is, and then multiple pieces, what are those bits and how do they fit together? I'm beginning to provide some clues here, but we don't have sufficient time to, you know, go through the rest of them. But there are lots of clues there.
I've got two questions that have come through on the live stream, but I think they sort of they merge into each other. So I might actually ask the question as two as one. So Jane has asked the question that, do you think that as an industry we need to change how we value timber? And as a follow-up to that also, in your opinion, could timbers from the current housing stock, i.e. 1950s houses that get demolished, be reused in new houses or engineered timbers, so sort of like retrofitting?
Right, so I'm not a timber technician, so I don't know about the utilisation of timber from older houses being reused to make another product. I do know about them being reused because, like everybody as a kid, I banged around with a hammer and nails and other types of things, but that's kind of the extent of my technical skills. But I do think that that is wood fibre. It is able to hold a house up now. Why couldn't it do some work in the future? That's not cheap. It's not a cheap option, but neither are some of the other things that we've talked about. So that has potential. Sorry, what was the first part?
Do you think that we should change the way we value timber?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to already. We have to value it in a supply chain and in a life cycle sense. We have to recognise in the emerging low carbon environment that the cost of the carbon embodied in the tree and therefore in the wood product that goes into a house as a long-term store of carbon actually has to be paid somewhere. And it has to be paid through an integrated system, which typically is a system of, originally we had one called the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. We've had other iterations, etc. But we have to recognise the underlying values in the products that we utilise. And one of the underlying values of timber in the built environment is it is a long-term store of carbon, and it's not recognised for that currently. That would help enormously. It clearly would help enormously. And it might even tip the dial in a way that would assist in some growers and some governments being able to acquire land upon which they can plant more trees. That's the future. But on their own, the timber processors and the growers can't do that. It's a national need met by a particular cohort. The nation needs to think about that supply chain from top to bottom, everybody here included.
So sort of like a cradle-to-cradle circular type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I work a lot in the paper industry where, let me shock you, 80% of our corrugated boxes are made out of old corrugated boxes. This is a circular economy. It doesn't even work economically unless it is a circular economy. I don't think it has to be very different in respect of the built environment. It just is currently. If we break what is and go for what we should go for, then we can achieve an outcome that's a bit less gloomy than my dismal propositions earlier.
So I worked with the Wood Solutions Mid-Rise Advisory Program for about 4 years. I'm now doing a little bit of work with them occasionally. I just wanted to add a little bit to the discussion around engineered wood products because, of course, we presented CLT, glulam, a bit about LVL. I think in terms of reuse in the future, there may be some real potential there when we're talking about those massive elements. But more specifically, talking about lightweight framing and the volume of our market, we obviously haven't seen a huge amount of engineered products in the framing space, just purely for studs, historically. But I just wanted to sort of put out there that there is the technology in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, to be creating engineered studs, things called Durolam, which use a lower grade timber, which is currently going to pallets, going to chip, going to all these things that aren't structure. So while we are at capacity, to an extent, there is still a lot of unrealised value, I suppose, in that sort of space. So I think obviously it'll be very interesting to see how that develops in the future. We're not currently making it in Australia, but it's interesting. There is a mature market in Europe and in America as well who are doing this. So it's just a matter of time before we start doing it here as well.
Yeah, and I think delving into every corner of the world to find the best possible solutions is the right approach to any problem these days. If we live in a global village, then we should be able to address our tyrannies of distance.
Thank you very much for that, Tim, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Fantastic.